Hello everyone, today we will be venturing to my home state of Wisconsin for a truly horrific crime that at first glance seemed to be a case of DV, but was actually something much scarier. Let me introduce you to beautiful Nicole VanderHeyden, a 31-year-old teacher and mother of 3. She had a son and daughter from a previous relationship and a 6-month-old son with her current partner, a 35-year-old man by the name of Douglas Detry. The couple went out for some drinks and separated over the course of the evening. Nicole went with her friends, and Douglas eventually went home as it was late, but he soon realized that Nicole had never returned. Douglas assumed that Nicole had just stayed at a friend's house because she had been drinking. However, later that afternoon, he went to the police department to report her missing. Police questioned why he had waited until that afternoon to report her missing, but went ahead and filed the missing person report. At this time, the police were already aware that the body of a woman had been discovered a mere 3 miles from Nicole's home, in a field by a farmer named Richard VanderHeyden. Sadly, due to the extent of injuries to the body, the police were unable to identify it right away. Dental records were used to confirm that this was in fact the body of Nicole. She had been found naked, only wearing a pair of socks and a pink wristband. She had been brutally beaten and strangled. Police noted that there was obvious trauma to the side of her head and had a lot of bleeding from that area. She also had a lot of abrasions and scratches on her back and the rest of her body. Police questioned Douglas and also searched his house, car, and cell phone. Plus, they spoke to his friends, and a disturbing pattern began to appear. Police discovered that on the night of May 20th, the couple had met up with friends. They arranged a babysitter for the baby and planned to let loose and have fun. The night started off well. They went to Green Bay to meet up with friends. They had tickets for a concert at a bar called the Watering Hole. After the concert, they went to another bar called the Sardine Can. Douglas did not go to the second bar with the group. Douglas stayed at the Watering Hole with his friend Greg, where they had a few more drinks. Nicole was not happy about this at all. She sent him a number of texts that implied he was abusive and controlling, and that she believed he was cheating on her. Despite her being frustrated with the state of their relationship, Nicole was seen on surveillance camera, dancing with her friends and seemingly enjoying herself. Though as the night dragged on, she became more frustrated and sent him more texts. He simply replied, "I'll be at the Sardine Can soon." By 11:30 p.m., Nicole was getting increasingly annoyed, so she made a call to Douglas. He did not answer the phone, but when one of her friends called from their phone, he did answer. This pissed Nicole off. Rightfully so. This prompted Nicole to leave the bar. One of her friends followed her out and tried to convince her to come back, but she outright refused. Her friends watched her walk up the road, talking on her cell phone, and then taking a left where she disappeared at the end of the street. This was the last time that Nicole was seen by her friends. Police further reviewed the surveillance footage and saw that Nicole had left on her own, and sometime later Douglas and Greg arrived and had a few drinks before leaving themselves. Police were now trying to figure out if Nicole made it home at all and what happened to her on her final walk. Police searched Nicole's home and found a number of items of interest. They found a pair of tennis shoes which appeared to have marks, smudges, and blood on them, and the pattern on the sole of the shoe appeared to match marks that were found on Nicole's body. They also noted what appeared to be blood on the floor of the garage and in Nicole's car. This led them to believe that she had been killed at home and transported in her own vehicle to the farm field, where her body was later discovered. 2 days after her body was found, her neighbor alerted the police that they found items that may be of interest to them. The neighbor had found a charger cord and clumps of blonde hair in the yard of their home. The hair had blood on it. Police discovered blood on the driveway, more hair with blood on it, 2 hairpins, and 2 more pieces of cable in the yard. Additionally, police found the outfit Nicole had been wearing the night of May 20th. It was covered in dirt and blood and located along a highway ramp, less than 2 miles from where her body was found. Her purse and cell phone were also found in this area. After the discovery of this evidence, Douglas was arrested. Police believed that once the DNA came back, he would be going down for first-degree murder. What actually happened was that when the DNA results came back, they matched an unidentified male, not Douglas. The items seized from the home tested negative for blood, all except for 2 pieces of evidence. However, one was not Nicole's blood, and the other was not human blood at all. Further evidence found by police cleared Douglas of being the one who carried out this brutal murder. A forensic crime analyst reviewed Douglas's Fitbit app and determined that between the hours of 3:10 a.m. and 6:10 a.m., Douglas had only taken 12 steps, which is more in line with someone walking down a hallway and not someone brutally murdering their girlfriend. After this mountain of evidence cleared Douglas, he was released from custody. Police were concerned that the focus on Douglas initially may push Nicole's case into the cold case category. Thankfully, a few months after her body had been discovered, the crime lab notified police that they were able to extract DNA from one of Nicole's socks. They ran the DNA profile through the national database and found a match. The DNA matched a man from the state of Virginia who had recently relocated to Wisconsin. This man was George Stephen Birch. Nicknamed Big Country for his stature, he was 6'7". He had a checkered past and had actually been acquitted of murder back in the 90s. At the time of Nicole's murder, he was a 40-year-old divorced dad who moved to Wisconsin for a fresh start. Now, police had to determine how in the world this man was connected to Nicole. Further investigation revealed that George was possibly a person of interest in an unrelated incident involving a vehicle. The vehicle had been the subject of a stolen vehicle report, a vehicle fire, and a hit and run. On June 8, 2016, the police questioned George about the vehicle case. He denied his involvement and told the police he had spent the night at a bar drinking and texting a woman. Since he brought up texting, the police asked for consent to see the text messages. George agreed to this, and the officer explained it would be easier to download the information off of his phone instead of having to take a bunch of pictures and then scan them into the system. George even signed a consent form giving police permission to do so. All of the information and data was downloaded and kept on file. Since the police had this information, the ones investigating Nicole's case decided to have a little look-see. They took note that he had a Gmail account and that Google may be able to provide his GPS location on the night of Nicole's murder. Google did have his GPS coordinates from that night and shared them with officers. George had been at a bar called Richard Cranium's, which was a mere half-mile from the Sardine Can, which was the last bar Nicole was at. He left the bar at 2:30 a.m. and then was tracked to Nicole's house. He spent about an hour there, and then off he went to the field just after 4 a.m., the field where Nicole's body had been dumped. He then went to the highway ramp where her clothing, cell phone, and purse had been found. He ended his night at home around 4:22 a.m. This was more than enough evidence to put a big arrow pointing at George, and he was promptly arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He pled not guilty. The prosecution utilized the Fitbit information from Douglas as well as the GPS data from George's cell phone to bolster their case. The jury was told that Nicole walked off angry from the bar after becoming frustrated with Douglas, and that her friends didn't see her again after that. Douglas testified that although their relationship had started off strong, it was far from perfect at the time of Nicole's death. 10 days prior to her death, Douglas had texted his mother stating that he was seriously thinking about asking Nicole and the kids to move out. Douglas went on to explain that Nicole didn't drink much, but that they had both been partying hard that night. He also explained that after he and Greg left the bar, he spoke to Nicole on the phone, but she wasn't making any sense. He was frustrated and handed the phone off to Greg, who asked Nicole to tell them where she was so they could pick her up. Sadly, before Nicole could give them her location, her phone died. They tried to call her back several times, but it went straight to voicemail. Douglas and Greg drove around the Sardine Can bar, but didn't see Nicole. They went inside, but Nicole's friends had also left. They decided to stay and have a few drinks and left for home around 2:15 a.m. Greg dropped Douglas off at home around 2:30 a.m. Once there, Douglas asked the babysitter to please try calling Nicole, but when she did, it went straight to voicemail. Greg and the babysitter left, and Douglas went to bed. Douglas was woken up around 6 a.m. to feed his baby son. He did notice that Nicole hadn't been home or been in touch. He went back to sleep until about 10:30 a.m. Once awake, he reached out to Nicole's friends, hoping they had been in touch with her, but they hadn't, and every time he called her, it continued to go straight to voicemail. That afternoon, he went and filed the missing person report. The officer who first spoke to Douglas testified that he had been very cooperative and had no scratches or any visible injuries on his body. He even gave consent for his home to be searched. The jury also learned that when Douglas had been told a body matching Nicole's description had been found, that he, quote, pretty much lost it. He was crying, sobbing, and practically hyperventilating. They were then told about the evidence, which led them straight to George. Everything from the DNA found on Nicole's sock to the Google search history, where he viewed news stories about Nicole's death, a grand total of 64 times. Prosecutors believed that George drove Nicole home and that he expected sex in return for this, but she rejected his advances and he went on to R-word her, brutally beat her, and strangle her with a charging cord. They suggested that she had gotten away and attempted to run towards her home, but he caught up to her and beat her on the driveway. Nicole's injuries suggested that she had been slammed on the ground repeatedly, as well as stomped on and kicked multiple times. Let me remind you, this man is 6'7". They then showed the GPS evidence, which showed him driving to the farm field, dumping her body, then on the drive home he tossed her items out of the car window. The jury was then shown photos of George the following morning, out fishing, with a friend, smiling and laughing like nothing had happened the previous night. The medical examiner who had performed the autopsy on Nicole testified that the victim had been beaten and strangled to death and had sustained 240 injuries to her body. The defense tried to argue that their client was innocent and her boyfriend Douglas had been the real culprit. They said that Douglas had caught George and Nicole in a consensual adult act and flew into a rage, which ultimately cost Nicole her life. The babysitter was called to testify for the defense, and when asked what Douglas had told her when he came home alone about where Nicole was, he said, and I quote, "I don't know, she hit her head and she just wanted to walk home." George took the stand and claimed that although he was with Nicole that night, he did not kill her. He stated they had met at Richard Cranium's bar and were flirting with one another that whole night, so around closing time he offered her a ride home, where she allegedly agreed, and he drove her the 8 miles to her house. When they pulled up across from her house, George claimed they were talking, which turned into kissing, which led to them being intimate. George claimed they had relations in the back of the car, with Nicole laying across the back seat and him standing with the rear passenger door open. George claimed he was knocked out and came to seeing Douglas standing over him with a gun. George claimed at this point Nicole was already deceased and that Douglas must have done it. He then claimed Douglas threatened him at gunpoint and ordered him to put Nicole's body in his car, drive it to the field, dump her in a ditch. George stated he did as he was told, but once at the field, he said he managed to lunge at Douglas and knock him over, at which time he escaped to his car and drove off. Then he spotted Nicole's items and tossed them out the window while driving. At this point, the defense and prosecution both gave their closing arguments, and the jury retired to consider the verdict. A mere 45 minutes later, the jury had a question, which seriously concerned the prosecution. They asked if they could compare the cord that was used in the murder to the cords found in the garage of Douglas's home. Thankfully, the jury came back with a verdict of first-degree intentional homicide after just 3 hours of deliberation. In a state without the option of the death penalty, George was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When sentencing, the judge told George that the death of Nicole was the most brutal murder that had been committed by one person in the history of Brown County. George was not happy about this, so he of course appealed on the grounds that his Fourth Amendment rights were violated when the judge had allowed data from his cell phone to be used during his trial. He argued that the initial download of data exceeded the scope of consent that he had given. He claimed he had only given consent for his text to be downloaded in connection to the case involving the vehicle. He stated that he had never given permission for them to download any of his data in regards to Nicole's case. He also argued that the evidence involving the Fitbit worn by Douglas should have been accompanied by expert testimony, so the jury had a full understanding, but since it wasn't, it was insufficiently authenticated. The Supreme Court rejected his reach of an appeal and upheld his conviction. They also stated that the evidence from the Fitbit was properly admitted even without the expert testimony. The jury in Nicole's case had not been informed that George had been connected to a murder in the state of Virginia, although in that case he had been acquitted. The jury was also not told about an incident that occurred in February of 2017, in which Nicole's sister was helping out with the baby, had went to a birthday party at a tavern, and on the way home, Douglas touched her leg in a sexual manner, to which she stated, "Please don't," which really pissed Douglas off, and he in turn began to drive at an accelerated speed. She begged him to stop and let her out, but he refused to do so. He ran his stoplight and only stopped the car when she began to kick at his windshield. Douglas pled no contest to second-degree recklessly endangering safety and false imprisonment, both domestic violence felonies. He also pled no contest to misdemeanor negligent operation of a vehicle. Another Brown County judge had accepted a joint recommendation from the prosecution and defense to withhold judgment on the felonies until a later date, and that they would be dismissed if Douglas remained out of trouble for 15 months. He also paid a $1,000 fine for the driving misdemeanor. This case is sad for so many reasons. She had 3 children, one of whom was a mere 6 months old. She was in a pretty toxic relationship, and she had the absolute misfortune of meeting another violent man when all she wanted to do was go home. Since this case involves DV, I will leave some resources below if anyone needs help getting out of a bad situation. As always, my heart goes out to her loved ones, and neither of the men in this case are what I would call decent. Please keep your loved ones close and safe. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon.